Hey friends, I'm excited for this video and then to gather with you all after this in our Google Meets where we're going to talk about this idea that God uses our plans when we have goals, but then we're also going to hang out and play some games. So I look forward to that time starting at 7 o'clock, right? So we're going to start at 7 so that if people weren't able to watch the video exactly at 6:30, they have some time to finish it, and then the Google room will be open at 7. And if you need the Google invite code, reach out to me and I'll get that to you. But like I said, we're continuing our series on goals. And tonight we're going to be talking about how God uses our plans when we have goals. So any goal that we have, if we want to achieve it, it helps for us to have a plan. So if our plan is a spiritual one where we want to spend more time with God, we need a plan. We need to plan out when we're going to be spending time with God, because if we don't plan that out, it can be easy for us to say, oh, well, soccer's happening, or, oh, I have ballet, or, oh, I have all this homework, right? And so we need to have a plan to help us make time to spend time with God. Or a plan also helps us when we're spending time with God, because if you have a plan on what you're going to do, so if you say, well, I'm going to spend time reading the Bible, that helps you know how to open yourself up to experience God. Or if you have a goal of being a more kind person, you don't just become kind overnight, right? You need to have this plan to be more kind. You need to think, well, I want to be kind in this way. And so you create a plan on how you can achieve being kind to your friends in that way. Plans are important when we make goals. So I want you to be thinking about your goals and what are the plans that you have for accomplishing those goals. When I think about a time where I created a plan to achieve a goal, it was when I was in seminary. So my time in college before seminary, I wasn't the best student. I wasn't terrible, but I wasn't the greatest. I was definitely more focused on building relationships, spending time with friends, hanging out, all of that. And it wasn't until my junior or senior year that I saw that it was important for me to study. It was important for me to pursue this education seriously if I wanted to be a pastor, or if I felt called to be a pastor. And so that's when I decided to go to seminary. And my goal in seminary was this: I want to give all that I have to seminary. I want seminary to be the most important thing in my life outside of God and Lauren. And so I created a plan. The first part of the plan was, well, I want to take classes that interest me. I love theology, and so I ended up picking up a concentration on theology, which meant I took more theology classes than, other classes during that time. I also invited people into my process of studying. I didn't just read and study on my own, but I would read and study with other people, ask them their perspective on the reading, ask them what they got from the reading. And we worked on projects and reading together, and that helped me put my education as a very important thing in my life, and it helped me learn more because I was learning in a communal environment. And then God helped me. I prayed and I asked God to give me the strength and the ability to be focused on school. And then lastly, I created a schedule. And so each week, especially during my last year, I would look at my schedule. I would say, okay, so here is my time with God. Here's my time with Lauren. I had to work, so here's my work. And then where in that can I spend time in my school first? And so I created a schedule and I created this plan. And so I don't tell you this story of my seminary time as a way to make myself look smart or talk about how well I did in seminary. I tell this story to show that it's important to have a plan, because my plan in seminary helped me achieve my goal of succeeding in seminary. And so we're going to look today at Nehemiah to see how he created a plan for his God-sized goal. If you remember last week, we talked about how Nehemiah had this big plan. Nehemiah and the people of Israel were taken from Israel 150 years. Well, Nehemiah wasn't actually taken from the land, but Nehemiah's people were taken from the land 150 years before this book of Nehemiah. And they were taken to a new land, and their old land was left in shambles. And God promised to restore Israel, to bring them back to their land and to restore their way of life. And he gave Nehemiah this God-sized vision to restore the people and to restore the land. And so Nehemiah spent time in prayer to discern, well, what would that look like? And Nehemiah came up with a plan. And so this week we're going to look at the plan. But first we're going to do a quick recap of last week in scripture. So we're going to look at verses from chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 4 and verse 11. So verse 4, when I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned and fasted and prayed to the God of heaven. And then verse 11. O Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. In those days, I was the king's cupbearer. So I think there are a few things that we can learn from these verses. Nehemiah didn't expect or ask God for step-by-step instructions. He knew God wanted him to lead the charge to rebuild the walls. And that was enough. He didn't say, I'm going to sit here and wait for you to tell me exactly how to do it. He started planning. But his planning, as we'll see, was rooted in prayer. So he started to plan, but invited God into the process. It was this partnership of Nehemiah and God discerning how to rebuild the walls. Nehemiah was already working on his plan. He asked God to help him be successful in what he was about to attempt. And then he said, I was the cupbearer of the king. And I think we can easily look over this, but I think it shows us something important. Nehemiah had the resources already available to him that God had given him. As the cupbearer, he had access and influence with the most powerful person in the world or in the kingdom. So he could go to that person and ask him to help him accomplish this God-sized goal. To sum it up, Nehemiah planned while he prayed. He invited God into the process of planning and of accomplishing this God-sized goal. And so today we're going to look at chapter 2. And I'm not going to read all of chapter 2, and I'm going to do a quick summary. So in the beginning of chapter 2, we discover Nehemiah hadn't just been praying and casually planning, but he had been preparing in great detail. So Nehemiah is around the king, and Nehemiah looks sad. And the king noticed this and asks him, why are you sad? And Nehemiah just straight up tells him, he said, because my city is in ruins. He already had that answer prepared for the king. This came out of his planning and preparation. Then the king asked him, well, what do you want? And Nehemiah said, to rebuild this city. He already had the request for the king prepared. Then the king wanted to know his timeline, and he had a timeline prepared for the king. And when the king seemed open to the ideas that Nehemiah had, he also gave a list of requests of what he needed to accomplish his goal. So he asked the king to write letters to governors in the area from the king. And in these letters, he asked the king to ask the governors for resources and material that Nehemiah would need to build the wall. He had these answers already and what he needed prepared ahead of time. So through this process of planning and praying, Nehemiah continued to invite God into that process through prayer. But he didn't wait for God to do all of the work. he was strategic and used the mind that God had given him to plan and prepare while he was waiting for the right opportunity. Because Nehemiah had prepared in detail for the opportunity that he hoped would come, he was able to ask the king for resources. He was faithful in the moment that God arranged. God arranged that moment for the king to be there and to ask those questions. Nehemiah was fully prepared to take advantage of the situation. Nehemiah was prepared while he planned. And Nehemiah, while he had this plan in place, when he arrived in Jerusalem, some of the people didn't like his plan. And it was time for him to recruit other people, but people didn't like that. So when he first arrived, what he did was he went to the walls and he inspected. He was like, okay, well, what do I need? What do these walls need to be rebuilt? And so he goes to each of the walls, at each side of Jerusalem, and he creates this plan of how he's going to build the walls, but while also knowing that there were some people who were opposing his plan. And so let's look at what he did after he looked at the wall. So we're going to be reading Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 15 through 20. So though it was still dark, I went up to the Kidron Valley, instead inspecting the walls before I turned back and entered at the valley gate. The city officials did not know I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. But now I said to them, you know very well what troubles we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. Then I told them about how the gracious hand of the Lord of God had been on me, and about my conversation with the king. They replied at once, yes, let's rebuild the wall. So they began the good work. But when the Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab who heard the plan, they scoffed contemptuously. These were the people who didn't like the plan when they had heard about it when Nehemiah arrived. And they said, what are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They asked. I replied, the God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall, but you have no share, no legal right, or no claim to Jerusalem. Nehemiah gained a few enemies in this process. And I think this is normal, when you're trying to follow a God-sized plan, that usually happens. But once again, when Nehemiah came across these people who opposed him, he was ready. He wasn't naive. He expected people to oppose him. That's why he went to the walls first. He knew how to hold his tongue and keep his secret from the people who opposed him. He was wise to know about who he trusted. Then he figured out a way to bypass the people who opposed him so he could recruit people who shared the same vision as he did for this God-sized goal. He surrounded himself with right people. To sum it up, Nehemiah planned for his opposition. Do you see this theme? Nehemiah is planning through this whole time to accomplish this God-sized goal. God gave him this huge task to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but God also gave him everything he needed. Nehemiah had access to God in prayer. He had God-given talents and wisdom and discernment and passions. He had the resources and the opportunities and connections that God had given him, and he had other people. Although Nehemiah probably got scared, like some of us might, when we were trying to accomplish a God-sized goal, he knew and trusted that God would work in his planning. Just like Nehemiah, you are created for God-sized goals. Think about one big goal that you want to achieve. God designed you with a brain that can strategize, people who can help you, and skills and resources to help you accomplish this goal. If you think you might have a God-sized goal growing in your heart, that's a great thing. Maybe last week you talked about that with your family. Either way, I think there are 4 things that we can see in the story of Nehemiah that can help us turn to God-sized goals in our life, right? First, the first thing we have is ourselves. There might be days where we feel insecure or about who we are or what we can do. I've been there. But God has designed each and every one of us with care, intention, and purpose. If God gives you a God-sized goal, ask, what can I bring to the table? What can I contribute? What has God given me that can help me accomplish this task that God has for me? God has given you a mind. God has given you a unique blend of skills, passions, and experiences to help you accomplish this goal. So we have ourselves. Then we have other people. Just like Nehemiah discovered, most God-sized goals cannot be accomplished alone. While there are some things we can accomplish on our own, if we want to make big change for the world, we need other people. So when you have a God-sized goal, ask yourself, who can I work with? Who in my life, which of my friends, family members, classmates, whoever it might be, can help me accomplish this God-sized goal? Then we have things. Just like Nehemiah needed extra supplies when he got the king's letters, he needed transportation, wood, letters, and a blessing. God has given us gifts and things that we can use to accomplish this goal. Maybe it's supplies. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's an opportunity. Maybe it's a platform or even a location. We need different things to help us accomplish these God-sized goals. And then, most importantly, last but not least, we have God. Whether your goal is an everyday size goal or a once-in-a-lifetime goal, God is with you. God is always present with you. And God wants to work with us as we work in the world. God is with you just like God was with Nehemiah. Like Nehemiah, God probably isn't going to give you step-by-step plans for achieving these God-sized goals. But that's okay. You don't need those because you already have everything you need. You were designed for God-sized goals. You have the resources. Now, what are you going to build?